Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Strat Gamer here, providing you with the new Anno 1800 episode, and today this is the ultimate palace guide. We're going to talk about the palace, the local departments, and you may have seen previous episode on it, but stay tuned because this is an episode done after the Tourist DLC and the Skyscraper DLC of Season 3, which did provide some updates to the palace that are quite important to take into account. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to look at many different things like which department to choose depending on what island you're doing, which policies to choose, many other elements based on your gameplay. So I'm not just going to cover, if you're a min-maxer, we're going to cover each type of gameplay, so do stay tuned for that. Before we dive in, please consider subscribing to the channel. It does really help a lot, and also you will never miss another video if you do press the subscribe and bell button. Okay, let's dive in, starting with where the palace is. So obviously it comes into the culture here towards the end. You can see the palace and the local departments. The palace you can only build once across your whole empire, and I usually really suggest you build it on Crownfall for a couple of reasons we'll get into, versus local departments you can only build one per island. So that's where it gets really interesting, because in the palace you have all departments, but then when you go to all your other islands you can only choose one department, one out of those 5. We are also not going to cover in this video one thing that is quite important, which is the attractiveness impact on the palace. If you do want to learn more about this, in particular if you want to learn why you should get 33,000 attractiveness, and you can see here I have exactly 33 on my capital where you have your palace. Do check out the video that will appear now at the top, and that's also in the description below if you want to watch it just after this one. But yeah, that will be very important to reach level 25 here in terms of prestige and get really the full impact of your palace. So let's dive really into what policies and departments and all of this now. First of all, before talking about the exact policies, let's tackle which department to choose depending on the island. And why do I say depending on the island? Because if you're playing Anno right, each of your islands should have a purpose. Of course, when I say that, some people are gonna say, yeah, but I like to make islands that are really pretty, that have that are more realistic because everything is on the island, there's less trades and all of this. Okay, that's totally fair. You can play like this if you want, but that's not what Anno is all about. Anno is a game where you have many islands, and the goal is to create trade routes between these islands so that you maximize your gameplay. And that's what Anno is all about, and that's why I said, each island should have a purpose, should have a goal, should have a specialization in a sense. And some of those specialization can be something like, this is an island that's going to produce a lot of farming goods. This is an island that's going to produce a lot of end goods. Or this is what I call a hub. This is where you're gonna transport a lot of resources in and out. Or this is an island that's providing you a lot of workforce that then going to be sent all over your empire to work. Or this is an island that's going to be, for getting a lot of specialists or item farming, what is called. So there's different goals like this, and depending on what you want, you'll choose a different department. So let's dive into this. Now we have those 5 departments. Maybe let's get here to see a better view of them, right? Department of Administration, Culture, Labor, Welfare, and Trade. So which one do you want depending on what? Now, if you're talking about something that's gonna produce, it's easy. You want Department of Labor. This is all about the production. Now, second, if you want something that's more like a hub, transport in and out, as the name says, you probably want Department of Trade. So that's this one. If you want something that's going to be about workforce, then you want Administration. And you can see that it's you can already sort of guess these just by the passive bonus, which is here. Even without any policies, just the passive bonus is quite linked to what I just said, right? For example, here, workforce, this one, productivity, this one, island storage. So, that's why this is hub, this is production, this is workforce. Then if you're trying to get to a higher population, let's say easily, right? You're trying to push your population, but it may not be a record. It's just you're trying to have a bit more higher population. Then it's probably the welfare because it makes it easier. Now, if you're trying to do specialist or item farmings, then that's where you're gonna want the culture one. You can see even once again the passive bonus quite linked to this, but also some of these elements we're gonna look at here. And then, okay, and now let's talk about the last one, is if you're trying to make max population islands. In the past, scholars were the way to go. And for scholars, it was actually the Department of Welfare, which was the best choice, because you were getting a big boost for your public buildings and you needed quite a number of public buildings. And on top of this, of course you had some good policies here, but the main also reason is you didn't need the bonuses that you're getting here for the scholars, versus for the skyscrapers, for your investors, actually Department of Administration is the way to go. And mainly not because of those policies, which is what you may be thinking about, but actually for the workforce. Because in a skyscraper record, because the new goods like cognac, lacquer, etc. will require a lot of workforce, that you can't, min-max out of it. You have to produce them. Therefore, you're going to need all of your islands to produce workforce for free, so that you can only have skyscrapers and not have, islands full of artisans and things like this. So Department of Administration is the way to go for your max population islands. Okay, now before going to which is the best policy to choose in each department, depending on what you want to do, let's talk about the changes from the iLife. First of all, there are changes around some of the policies. Let's look at administration, the creative cuisine. If you read the description, resident consumes 30 less things, and in particular, the new ones are chewing gum and biscuits. So there's new goods impacted here, and in particular, biscuits can be a big game changer. Secondly, the skill labor act. This one is a huge one, because it used to be, let's be honest, quite useless, because it was producing extra 1 out of 3 for things like steel beams, weapons, advanced weapons, which you didn't really need that much of. I mean, maybe somebody was using it to produce steam motors and steam carriages, but yeah, that wasn't huge. Versus many of the new goods like elevators, biscuits, typewriters, and lacquer are impacted by this one. And these productions don't really have a lot of items that impact them. So having a policy with 1 out of 3 is huge here. So this one is quite important to keep in mind. And then last, let's say big change is a late license act in the welfare. Here, residents consume 20% less things, and in particular now you have the cognac. The cognac is something that does take quite a bit of resources to produce, and you're gonna need quite a bit of, so it can be really good. Also, if you look at the rest of the description, we're also talking about coffee and champagne, so 2 other goods for your investors. So there is the let's say, big changes in terms of the actual policies, but like I mentioned before, there are other changes that you may not have realized. Things like that to have a lot of skyscrapers, you're going to have a lot of workforce, and therefore Department of Administration with its plus 300 island workforce per town hall on each of the tier is becoming really, really important, versus something like 60 area of influence for all public buildings actually becomes less important because the skyscrapers have less public services building than the scholars, for example. So that's also other change to keep in mind. Now let's get into actually what is my suggested best policy depending on what you want to do. And let's go by order. To make it easy, we start with the Department of Administration. As I said, you probably want it definitely if you're focusing on workforce, but there may be other reasons. The first one is on your capital, you definitely want this one, the Guildhall Act, plus 200 attractiveness per town hall. If we actually look here, you know, this is all this town hall in blue. Oh, I'm missing this one here. Can do it. Yep. With this, and you see I just got more attractiveness than at the beginning of the video thanks to that. This is how you can get a lot of attractiveness easily. Whatever you're doing on the island, right? Because if you're using the island for production, having a few town halls around is not gonna make you lose a lot of space. And if you're making population on Crownfall, then of course you want the town halls. You see 15,000, half of what I need is already covered by those town halls, just thanks to this policy here. So this is definitely the policy you want on your capital. This is probably the only place you want it, because attractiveness is usually useless, to be honest. The only other place where you may want it is if you're trying to get specialists, but in that case, you will also maybe look at Department of Culture. We're gonna talk about that. So I'm actually, let's talk about it now, is if you're trying to do specialist farmings, you have two ways to do it. One is with Department of Culture, the other is with Department of Administration, where you're going to use, actually not this one here, you're going to use this one, the Open Mine Act, because you're going to put 4 items into that. And if you want me to do another video on more dedicated to specialist farming, don't hesitate to tell me about, but there's many already on YouTube. So that one you may want to choose for specialist farming. Then you may also, if you're now talking about, let's say more population elements, you have 2 that you could choose. Either this one, the Open Mine Act, or the Creative Cuisine. This one, you know, honestly, storage, that's useless. You can have a lot of storage with other elements. And this one, Influence +1, it's also not that important from your, engineer residence. Because first of all, you probably won't have that much engineer residence. And second, it's a lot better to use investors and especially skyscrapers to get that influence. But those 2 for population can be quite powerful. As we said in the past, this one add 1 socket to your town hall. That can be quite useful to increase your workforce, for example. This is really the one you want to go for if you're trying to increase your workforce, because there are a lot of items that have workforce plus 50%, workforce plus 40%, those type of things. But otherwise, you actually probably want to use this one, especially for scholars. As we said, this one is useless, but even for skyscrapers, the 30% increase that you're getting here for, if we're talking about investors, it's chocolate, chewing gum, and biscuits. That is quite huge. It's really hard to beat that. There are, of course, some items that you could. It really also depends on what you're doing. If you're using docklands and things like this, because if you're using, for example, dockland to get all of your chocolate or things like this, then maybe you think this is less useful, and then you may want to use this one, for example, to put the item that Aristella that takes out all of your need for champagne. It's 100% for champagne. So those 2, it's really hard to tell you definitely which one to use, because it depends a lot on what you're trying to do. but definitely consider those two for your population and this one for your capital. Now moving to the Department of Culture, this one is a lot easier. Once again, for your capital, you want this one. You want the Estate Collections Ask, that gives you plus 250 attractiveness per completed set in your museum, zoo, and things like this. With that, you really need a lot less zoo. So you see here, I only have a few museums, sorry. They each provide 3000 attractiveness because they get this plus 250. So each of these things here, instead of just giving me, for example, this one, instead of giving me 30 plus 40 plus 40, which is 110, it's gonna give me 360. So that's huge. The difference is definitely huge. It is worth noting that it will work only once per set. So, there's no point in having in your same museum twice of these, like twice of that, twice of that, twice of that, because you will only get the bonus once. And that's why I actually have 3 museums instead of one huge one here. So that is what you want on your capital. You want this one. Now, if you're doing specialist farming, you're going to want this one, which is Right to Remain Act, which will increase the quality of the people that visit. And on top of that, you have this bonus here that will really help you get more and more of the specialists. This one, influence per module, probably really don't need it. Similarly here, this is for your museum module, for your zoo module, so it doesn't even impact everything. And then that one, +1 reward for World Fair event. Maybe 2 years ago that was good, but now that we have the Research Institute and all those type of things, honestly, the World Fair is useless. So I definitely don't suggest you take this one. Moving on to a very interesting one is the Department of Labor. And why is it very interesting? Because depending on what production, the best one will change. Let's start with the easy one. Is all of your farms, you want the Land Reform Act. Grain, hops, potatoes, red peppers, grapes, wool, pigs, and beef, 1 out of 2. That is huge. This is really, really huge. If you don't believe me, I'll put in the description below. I made a previous videos where I tried to do, the best island with 4 items for my peak production, and I got to 1,500 peaks per minute. Then I didn't change anything else. I just took out this 4th item, which was definitely the best item you could put, and I put the Land Reform Act. I jumped to 2,000 peaks per minute. So that is huge, and it's true for all productions. Now, if you don't believe me, I'm happy to do another video diving into that. Do tell me in the comments below. But yeah, any island that you're focusing on farms, you want this one for sure. Now, if you're doing heavy industries, and in particular now, if you're trying to do a skyscraper, record, you're gonna need a lot of lacquer, you're gonna need a lot of typewriters, biscuits. You're gonna use that Skilled Labor Act on the island where you produce this. So once again, that's why I'm saying you need to specialize your island. You need to decide, this is an island made for this. I'm going to build, this type of buildings, and therefore I'm going to use this department. And it's also linked to the size of the island, right? If you're saying, I'm going to specialize this island on lacquer, biscuit, and typewriter production, then you calculate how much you need of that for your whole empire, and then you see what size of island you need, and you choose that one and you build it. So that's the second one. Now, if you want this one, the Galvanic Grant Axe, it gives you a 50% electricity boost. So as soon as you have electricity, you gain productivity of 50%. This is basically all the productions where your 4th item, you put a 4th item to it, you would get less than 50%. So basically the 4th item isn't good enough to warrant putting a 4th item. Therefore you will put this one. This is things like the filament factory. There's very few items that are really good, and particularly the fourth one's not that good. Or the flour production for your biscuit. This is the one you want to choose. Now, this one, the Factory Inspection Act, it decreases your workforce by 50%. There's actually no real reason to use it, because if we look into our items, Control T, if you look at all production buildings, noun, you have two items that reduce by 50% the workforce. This one, which also reduces your maintenance cost, by the way, and is only an epic one, and then this one, the human incarnate, minus 50% workforce too. So with those two, you can always get to 0% workforce in the buildings that get this bonus. And the reason I'm saying that is because the new productions like cognac, etc., it doesn't work. But for all the others, you have those two. So given that you have those two, you're already getting to 0. So why would you use this one? In particular, because the second reason is what I said before, is you want each of your islands to be specialized on something, right? So you want policies that can cover as many buildings as possible, right? And this one, there adds one more socket, right? And one more item to your trade union. So therefore, you could always put those two items if you need it to reduce the workforce. But if you don't need to reduce the workforce, then you can put something else, right? So this one, let's say, is more restrictive. It's less good than this one. So you will always choose this one above that one. Versus, as we've seen just before, there are situations where you don't want this one, and you want this one, because that one would give you less bonus than this one with the 50%. That's why you don't use factory inspection, but there are productions where the Union Subsidies Act is interesting. Things like wood, chassis, cognac, orchards, then you definitely want the Union Subsidies Act. Moving on to the fourth, the Department of Welfare. Here, similar to, let's say, administration, I can't tell you exactly which one is best because it will depend on a few things. But what I can tell you is that those two are not very useful. 50% bonus income from university, variety theater, electricity, and bank. I mean, sure, it's good. Like, income is good, but it's not. It's unless you're doing a skyscraper record, you're not gonna need the income. You should never have income problem, unless maybe you're really in your early game when you're trying to manage the transition between artisans to engineers or engineers to investors. Maybe at that point, okay, you use that, but later on in your game, you should never have this. Similarly here, 3 attractiveness for artisan and engineers residence, maybe very early on in your game, but after that, that's useless. This one can be useful from time to time. It increases the influence of your power plants. In particular, if you are doing a scholar max population, as we said, Department of Welfare was the way to go. And for scholars, depending on the islands, those 3 can be good. For investors, you probably don't want this one. You also probably don't want this one for investors because there are ways to get happiness that are quite easy. For your scholar, it can definitely be useful because given that you have for scholars the university, the electricity, and the radio tower, that's 15 happiness. That's quite a bit of happiness, and that way you don't have to provide any of the luxury goods. But usually you really want this one instead, which is the late License Act, because it will reduce your coffee, your champagne, and your cognac at investor level. And even for the other tiers, it's always quite good things like beer, rum. This is something you need a lot of usually. So go with this one in general. And then lastly, the Department of Trade. As I said at the beginning, you're probably doing this one if you want to do a hub. So if you want to do a hub, then Naval Logistic Act will probably be what you want, because loading speed plus 50%, that's quite big to really reduce the time that your ships spend at the harbor. Versus, I mean, the other one are not bad, but it's just that once again, if you think about each island having a purpose, you probably will never make an island focus only on those things. Like, this increases the productivity of your harbor things, like your sand or your fish. You're never gonna have an island that just does that only. So probably never that useful. Similarly, storage, that's really not a lot, especially since Dockland. Then fuel, so storage only for your oil, that's even less important. I mean, maybe in the new world I could have used that in 1 or 2 islands that are really focused on a hub for oil, but because I can't put local departments in the new world, that's useless. And lastly, one additional socket in your harbor master office. Once again, really not that useful, especially since we have Dockland. So these ones, if Ubisoft wants to change something, I think this one they should. So here it is, ladies and gents. We'll talk about which department to choose depending on your island, and then we should discuss which policy to select. And once again, we didn't discuss what the impact of attractiveness, because I made a previous video really focused on that, why you should get to 33,000 and also how to get there. So don't hesitate to check that video in the description below. If you like this video, don't hesitate to press the like button, and I hope to see you next time.